Hi everyone. So I'm here with Miss Carper, an English teacher at Gilman, and I was wanted to interview her about her views or opinions on or experiences on alcohol consumption. So Miss Carper, how do you feel about alcohol? Do you feel that consumption, regardless of quantity, is detrimental to health?
I think for adults who are fully developed in terms of brain development, I think that any consumption is not necessarily detrimental to health, but I think it's easy to become
Okay.
at a point where it would be detrimental.
Okay.
I think a lot of adults still, even though you see this more commonly in teens experimenting with alcohol, you see it in adults too when they overconsume, certainly detrimental. Yeah. So I think in reasonable quantities and safe quantities, sure, but there's a danger with over consuming, and so that's always a risk.
Okay. So when you say that it's okay to consume a certain amount. Is that for social reasons? Do you think that there's a relationship between an individual's alcohol consumption and their social status or their social life?
I think that society has certainly given us that relationship. I think a lot of people perceive alcohol being a social activity, right? I don't necessarily think that. I guess I don't have a ready answer for this question. Yeah, I think that when I'm talking about over-consuming, it's usually due to people who are socializing and trying to keep up with others. There's a pressure to consume, oftentimes in a social encounter.
Mm-hmm.
And so people who choose not to drink or choose to have one drink and limit themselves there can often face a little bit of pressure from the people that they're around to consume more. And so I think in that way, yes, there is certainly a relationship between consumption and a social life.
So it's like people who consume less are considered weaker, while people who consume more are.
I don't know if weaker is the right word. I would say maybe not as fun, not as laid back.
Okay.
I would say oftentimes the stigma might be if I'm out with my friends and I'm having a drink, if they choose to have another and say, well, it's a school night, I'll often be kind of seen as straight laced, or not very laid back.
Yeah. Okay. So, if you're willing to share, how has alcohol impacted your life?
I would say that when I was in high school, there was definitely a pressure. I felt like because I didn't drink, I wasn't often invited to parties where I would, hang out with people outside of school. And so there were a lot of times on the weekends where I felt a little bit isolated from my peers because I'd made that choice not to drink. Um, I know that a number of my friends who I was really close with in middle school and then in early high school, I no longer remained as close with because that's how they wanted to spend their weekends. And so that was definitely hard for me. I remember, struggling with that choice and feeling left out. When I got to college, there was an even more increased pressure. In order to be a part of the social life, it felt like that was an expectation in a lot of ways. And I do think probably early in college, in my fear of not making friends, of missing out on social opportunities, I certainly overindulged in a way that I shouldn't have. And my grades suffered, my energy levels suffered, and by the time I was a junior, I really had kind of an awakening moment where I realized I was wasting my time when I was at school, and I needed to make new friends and have new social groups in order to, make the best of my opportunities while I was there. So that's kind of my personal impact. Looking at the following question, you say, how has alcohol impacted someone you know? I have an uncle who's an alcoholic.
Okay.
And watching how that's affected his family relationships and his ability to keep a job, it's been tough on his family. And that's always been kind of in the back of my mind, something that I want to make sure that I avoid since it does run in my family.
Okay. So, apart from the slight pressure you faced in high school and then increased pressure in college, it hasn't impacted you in a way that it's been detrimental to your surroundings or
what do you mean by my interactions with others? I think that when you overindulge, your walls fall down and you certainly say things to people that you wouldn't ordinarily say. And I've certainly found myself in those situations. If I've had more than a couple of drinks, the way that I interact with other people, I often wake up thinking, oh gosh, I can't believe I said that to somebody. Or I might get into an argument with somebody over something stupid. You're not thinking clearly. Your cognitive abilities are diminished. And yeah, I would say that I've had certain interactions as a result of having more than a couple of drinks that I would regret.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So moving on, have you noticed that those experiences that you faced, whether it be in high school, college, or your uncle, have they impacted your decisions? I know you said that it impacted. You always have that thought at the back of your mind, but has it impacted any direct decisions?
Certainly. Especially by the time I was a junior in college, I started associating with different people. I started joining other social activities and different groups on campus because I realized the people that I had associated myself with up until that point weren't putting me in a healthy place. I would show up at a party, and that was all anyone was doing. And in fact, that was all anyone was really talking about. And I felt like if I wanted to make real friends who I had actual things in common with, I needed to make a choice. And so I made that choice in college. And then even since college, I went to school in Baltimore, and so I'm close geographically to a lot of the people I went to school with. And I've intentionally separated myself even further since college, just because that's not a social environment that I want to be around.
That community is not in the same path you want to follow.
Right.
Okay. So let's just continue. So I have a few statistics.
Sure.
So according to the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, men drink on average twice as much as women. Why do you think that that's the case?
I think that as much social pressure as I felt as a woman, I think that men feel an increased amount of pressure, even more pressure than women do. I've been thinking a lot about the role that social stigma plays on men versus women, and I think in our contemporary climate, women don't have as many pressures based on social stigma as men do. Men are told they have to be a certain way, act a certain way in order to be a man. And I think part of that, especially in high school and college, is doing what everybody else is doing. And when you feel a pressure that everybody else is drinking, I need to as well, I think that can lead to overconsumption, right? When you're trying to keep up with those around you. I think for men, especially, and I'm speaking in general terms, right? Not every man is this way, not every woman is this way, but I think in a lot of cases, men have to deal with more pressures than women, and oftentimes that's hard to deal with.
So, historically, that's there's a lot of instances where women have had.
Very true.
Where women have had to be a woman. What do you think is the reason that that's changed?
Why has it changed?
Yeah.
I think in large part because of the feminist movement, right? As women started to say, no, we don't have to be a certain way. We don't have to mold to certain stereotypes. We don't have to have certain career paths or family paths. I think that's opened up a lot of options for women, and that movement hasn't happened for men, right? Men have kind of been limited in that sense. They haven't had the opportunity to have multiple ways of being, right? There's still very much that stereotype of what a man is supposed to be. And I think in a lot of stereotypes, men are supposed to be, there's a competitive nature with men. And so I often see with overconsumption, and when you say when men drink on average twice as much, you mean in terms of quantity?
Yeah, quantity as well as frequency.
Okay. I think there's a competitive nature too, right? Where, if you're sitting with a group of friends and there's a game involved that involves alcohol, it's easy to get caught up in that in a competition that I think men feel maybe more than women. And again, I'm speaking in general terms.
Does it have anything to do with a man feeling like he has to be more of a man?
I think yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. And I'm speaking anecdotally, of course, and from my own observations, but just from friends that I've witnessed in social settings, there'll be name calling associated, right? If you're not having a drink, different derogatory slurs that are meant to attack manhood, right?
Okay.
Masculinity. That certainly comes into play.
So coming a little bit more personal to you, do women experience similar pressures, at least in your experience?
Not to the same extent. I think the pressures that women feel are, yes, certainly there are pressures, but I think there's not that same competitive nature. If a woman is called a name, oftentimes I think women are better able to kind of let that roll off. I'm not sure why that is. That's just from my own encounters with people. But I think especially when someone's masculinity is being threatened, that's when they tend to bend to pressure. Whereas with women, I don't think if my femininity is threatened or my womanhood is threatened, I sort of would laugh that off. That wouldn't be a serious insult to me.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. So, a little bit more on the statistics side. More than 50% of Americans 12 or older, according to American Addiction Centers, are current alcohol users. What do you think about this?
That's surprising to me. 12 or older, that's surprising. I guess surprising because of the age being so low, but the fact that 50% of Americans are alcohol users is not surprising given pop culture, what we see in movies, television shows, books. Alcohol is a major part of American culture, right? Visually, and so I guess maybe it shouldn't surprise me that it's 12 or older because kids are exposed to that and therefore want to be a part of that cultural dynamic.
Yeah, I was certainly surprised by it because, I mean, the law says that you have to be 21 or older in most states to drink.
Right.
However, that law is actually extended to say that within if your parents are getting you alcohol, it's fine for a glass, I think, per day.
Oh, really?
Whereas, or in the presence of a parent or guardian. So there's some contradictions that we can see there.
I did not know that. That's very interesting.
Yeah. What do you think about these contradictions in the law?
Well, it's certainly sending mixed messages, right? I think that the law was established at 21 because, the community was worried about development, right? Any kind of intoxicating substance, alcohol or any drugs, is going to affect brain development. And isn't it? I guess I don't know this number for sure, but is it 21 or 25 that the brain is officially finished developing? Do you know that?
One or the other.
Yeah, sure. I don't know, but I think by saying it's okay with your parents, it's almost like we're disregarding the actual science behind a body's development, especially a brain's development. Cognitive reasoning. It almost sounds like, well, this isn't really a law for any good reason. It's just a law for the sake of it being a law, having that kind of contradiction in place. That certainly sends mixed messages.
Yeah, definitely. So, are there any other contradictions that you see? What are those contradictions that you see regarding alcohol?
Contradictions in what sense?
So I know you were talking. We were talking about how one drink is not that bad.
I think I don't know if that's necessarily a contradiction. I would say one drink isn't damaging if you are of a certain age where your development is kind of reached a point where you're finished, right? I don't know a lot of the research behind how red wine affects the body, but you do hear about how a glass of wine a day can be really good for the heart. I recently heard that one of the only effective ways to kind of stave off the effects of Alzheimer's is, in fact, a glass of wine a day because it thins the blood, which is apparently very good to keep that off, which I did not know that. And so for that reason, I think it can't be the worst thing for your body, right? If they're noticing positive effects. I think it's when anything is taken out of moderation and applied in case of overconsumption. But I think that's a delicate balance, and especially for people whose brains aren't fully developed, for teenagers, even for young adults, it's a hard thing to figure out. And because you haven't reached a point of development where you can determine that, you're still experimenting with that line, and that can be more dangerous than anything.
So how have these contradictions influenced your decisions?
Well, I know that when I was in high school, observing my uncle, observing my friends get sloppy and make fools of themselves, it was very much, I don't want to be a part of that. When I was in college, the group of friends that I made, it felt like that was the only way to be invited to the party. And then, I mean, I feel like I'm repeating myself a little bit, but ultimately.
Oh, I was trying to focus more on the contradictions that you've seen.
Oh, the contradictions.
Yeah.
Okay. So the contradictions in the sense of
the red wine.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't drink every day. I drink probably on the weekends, maybe a couple drinks at most. I really don't drink very much, but I don't know if I have a ready answer for that question.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. So how do you think the science and society are contributing to the contradictions surrounding alcohol?
Well, I think if you look at things from a scientific perspective, we're worried about development, right? We're worried about how alcohol physically affects the body. Whereas from a societal lens, we're often given the message that it's okay to drink, it's okay to indulge, everything in moderation, right? And I think sometimes it can be hard to balance those two ideas. Here's how it's going to physically affect me, but from a societal point of being told that it's okay, perhaps that's a contradiction that we can talk about right there. That I don't know how to change that. I'm not sure how to change the societal view on alcohol consumption because it does seem so deeply ingrained and entrenched in everything we consume, right? In terms of pop culture, but also conversations with family. I think most kids observe their parents engaging in consuming alcohol with other friends or family members. It seems to be such a deeply entrenched part of American life. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to adjust that.
Okay, yeah. So, have you found that one influences you more than the other, science or?
Probably science, the physical effects of alcohol on the body. I mean, that certainly was one of the bigger influences when I was in high school and when I was in college, ultimately making a choice because I would feel the physical damage that was being done to my body, right? You feel awful the next day, your brain isn't working as clearly. All of that certainly helped me to kind of look at alcohol differently, I think, than some of the other people that I surround myself with. That being said, I certainly don't drink alone. I only drink in social settings, and so I'm sure that both have had probably an impact on me, maybe an equal impact.
Okay. So I'm sure many people have the same, have similar experiences. Why do you think it was that? Why do you think you chose a path as opposed to others?
I don't know if I have a good answer to that question either. I think from a young age, I wasn't quite as susceptible to peer pressure as some of the other people that I was around. I'm a much more independent person. I like being by myself. And so sometimes it stung not being invited to parties, but ultimately it didn't sting enough to make me want to change that.
So, like, not succumbing to peer pressure?
Yeah, I don't know why that was, though. I mean, I guess probably because I enjoy being alone. I enjoy spending time by myself. I grew up reading a lot, obviously. But yeah, it didn't bother me quite as much as other people. I mentioned that seeing some of my friends who I was close with in middle school and early high school, and I'd lost touch with them. I have one friend in particular where that was the case, where we were very, very close, all of middle school, ninth, 10th grade, and it was hard for her not to be invited to things. She was a much more outgoing person. She was very social. She didn't like being alone. She liked to always surround herself with people. And the easiest way to do that was, to go to the parties and act a certain way. And so I don't know that there was any real distinction between the two of us other than she enjoyed being around other people and I also enjoyed being by myself. I don't know if I have a ready answer for that either.
Mm-hmm. No, that was a good answer.
Of
that was
it.
a good answer.
Yeah.
What do you think are some ways that we can reduce the whole, reduce the contradictions, or at least the societal contradictions?
Well, I think it's naive to think that we can stand in front of a room of teenagers and say, it's not cool to drink, look at the effect on your body. I think if you just rely on science, kids might roll their eyes, but everybody else around me drinks, right? All of my friends drink, or my parents drink, my family drinks. I think it's naive to say that we can just stand in front of them and spout statistics at them. However, I do think that knowing those things is important. I know in terms of other illegal substances like drugs especially, whenever I hear about the irreparable damage that certain drugs do on a person's body, it once again deters me from ever experimenting with those sorts of substances. And so I think that knowledge is still useful. But I think we also have to establish a community where people respect other people's choices and can respect that someone might say no. I think a lot of the pressure comes from a fear of being ridiculed for saying no.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we as a school community, even if we're just keeping it at Gilman, we can do better with respecting other people's choices.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if that happened, then, I don't know, maybe I'm still being naive, but then maybe some of that would be reduced, right? Some of that pressure that people feel.
And in turn, that would also reduce the underage drinking problem that we're facing.
And again, maybe I'm being naive, but, just hypothetically, that might be an avenue. I'm not sure how to go about that change, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, sure. So my final question is, what would you think if I wanted to try alcohol?
Well, I would ask you why you wanted to try alcohol, if it was
Okay.
because you were feeling social pressure, and I would try to convince you. I know that that's sort of impossible to convince a teenager that it doesn't really matter if you fit in or not, ultimately, but I would try to persuade you to look at, why you were feeling that social pressure, and ultimately what would happen if you said no, not that much, really,
Mm-hmm.
which I think at a developmental point where high schoolers are, it's hard to see nothing would happen.
Okay.
There's a fear of social ostracizing, but that would probably be where I would start. Why is it that you want to drink? Is it because you're facing pressure from your friends? Let's address that first.
Okay.
And then I would also probably try to convince you about the developmental risks.
Okay, so quoting science again.
Yeah, I think that we've talked about this in English class, but I think the most effective argument will incorporate the ethos, pathos, and logos, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think in order to really address all areas that you might be feeling pressure from, I might say, okay, let's talk about the pathos. Why are you feeling like you need to do this? Let's talk about ethos. Let's look at the morality of this, and then let's look at the logos, the argument, the logic behind it. I would try to kind of break it down that way.
Okay. But do you think that this could go down a wrong path by me starting out too early, or do you think I should never try it?
I think that starting too early would certainly lead down a path that would be dangerous. I think you are more likely to overconsume the younger you are when you try alcohol, because it's hard for you to recognize where a line might be. And then in overconsuming an alcohol, that might lead to the overconsumption in other areas, right? I've talked with Mr. Molina, another English teacher at Gilman, about this. This idea that kids who are over consuming on different substances, I won't restrict it just to alcohol, but extending it even further, it's because they're trying to mask something. It's meant to like be a medication of some kind. So we need to figure out what that is underneath the surface. But ultimately, if you're using this kind of shortcut, like alcohol would be a shortcut here in this example, you're missing the opportunity to fill that space with something that's healthy for you.
Okay. So ultimately, you would say you would try to persuade me not to use alcohol at least until my time at Gilman is over.
I would, yes. Yes, I
Okay.
think that at this point it could have irreparable damage.
All right. Thank you so much, Miss Carper. Yeah, that's all we have for the interview.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.